It was the kind of cold that bites through wool and skin alike, the kind that makes breath drift in slow, ghostly clouds. The morning sun had barely risen, and yet the churchyard was already cloaked in that dim grey light that seems to drain the colour from everything it touches. The bell tolled low, each strike lingering in the air as if reluctant to fade. People stood in small clusters, their coats drawn tight, their eyes fixed on the black box resting at the edge of the open grave. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The young woman's coffin was polished, almost too perfect, the kind of shine that catches the weak light and turns it into something cold. Men with pale faces and gloved hands took their positions, the ropes straining as they lowered her into the ground. The sound came then, a hollow knock, sharp and thin, like knuckles rapping on an empty door. It echoed faintly beneath the dirt, breaking the rhythm of the bell. A few heads turned, but no words followed. Only the Reverend's voice rose, steady and deep, as if drowning out the noise. I stood among them, and I felt it, the weight of something wrong pressing into the silence, the kind of wrong that is not loud or violent, but slow, patient, and certain. Her name would be etched into stone by nightfall, and from that moment on, she would belong to the dead. But if the box was empty, where was she? The thought pulled at me, but the others seemed unmoved. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering something, only to be hushed with a quick, sharp shake of her head. Faces stayed fixed on the ground, or the Reverend, avoiding one another's eyes. When the final shovelful of earth fell, it landed with a sound that was almost hollow too, as if the soil itself knew there was nothing beneath it. Later, I would learn that hers was not the first. That in the past 12 years, there had been coffins that felt light when carried, graves filled too quickly, the absence of that heavy thud when wood meets earth. The stories were always told in fragments, always under breath, as if the truth was something that could summon trouble. Some said the dead were taken elsewhere. Others swore they had never been dead at all. In the village, the church stood like an old sentinel, watching over its rows of stones and its secrets. Inside its ledgers were names and dates, written in neat, unwavering ink. 157 of them. How many of those lay beneath the soil? How many had been lowered into the ground only to vanish into some other darkness? The bell rang once more, and in that fading sound, I could not tell if it was mourning the dead or warning the living. The stones stood in perfect rows, their edges softened by rain and time, but their carvings still sharp enough to catch the light. Names and dates stretched out before me like a ledger written in stone, each one marking the end of a life, each one telling only the barest truth. 12 years' worth of loss, all contained in this small patch of earth. The moss clung to the base of the older graves, while the newer ones seemed almost polished, as if they had been placed there not long ago. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and old leaves. My eyes traced the pattern, and I began to feel it. The strange sameness in the way the markers stood. The spacing was too exact, the lettering too uniform. Even the weathering seemed measured, as though someone had been curating grief rather than recording it. The deaths, according to the neat lines in the local registry, were caused by fever, drowning, a fall from a horse, a house fire. Ordinary tragedies, if such things can ever be ordinary. But the more I read, the more it felt like these tragedies had been selected, placed in a line like notes in a song. In the church archives, the same precision appeared. The handwriting in the burial ledger never wavered, year after year. The number was clear, 157 funerals. I let the weight of that number settle in my mind. So many stories that ended here. Yet, when I began to match the records to their reported deaths, the gaps emerged. Some had no witnesses to their final moments. Others were last seen walking home at dusk and were never found until the day of their burial. And in more than a few cases, there had been no body at all, only a coffin closed before the mourners could see inside. Standing in that graveyard, I began to think less of loss and more of arrangement. These were not random tragedies scattered over time, but a series, a collection. Each stone was another line in a story I did not yet understand. A story someone had gone to great trouble to write, and even greater trouble to keep hidden. The wind shifted, rustling through the grass, and for a moment it sounded like the murmur of voices, too soft to catch, too far to follow. I looked at the stones again, at the neatness of their order, and I felt it deep in my chest. This was not just a resting place, it was a record, and records, unlike the dead, are kept for a reason. The village sat low against the hills, its narrow streets curling around the church like threads around a spool. Stone cottages leaned into one another, their windows small and watchful. Life here moved at the pace of the seasons, marked by market days, Sunday bells, and the slow toll of years. Outsiders rarely came, and those who did never stayed long. The people kept to themselves, bound together by blood, history, and a quiet obedience to the church at the center of it all. When I spoke to the descendants of those who had lived through the years of the 157, they told their stories carefully, weighing each word before letting it go. There was trust in the clergy, they said, as if the church were not just a place of worship, but a shield against the chaos of the world. Questions about the dead were not asked. Not because answers were unwelcome, but because asking was seen as dangerous. There was a phrase that passed from one generation to the next: "Do not disturb the dead." At first it sounded like superstition, the kind of warning found in old folk tales. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like a rule. People avoided funerals they were not required to attend. They did not speak the names of the recently buried after nightfall. Even the children were taught to look away from the churchyard after dusk. It was less about fear of ghosts, and more about fear of the living, fear of what might happen to those who seemed too curious. One woman, her voice a trembling thread of sound, told me something she had carried since she was a child. She remembered a funeral, though she was too young then to know the name of the man they buried. She remembered being lifted by her father so she could see over the shoulders of the crowd. The coffin was lowered into the ground, and as the first spadeful of dirt struck it, she smelled it. An absence, a strange dry scent, where there should have been the heavy, unmistakable smell of the dead. Years later, she realized what it had been. It was the smell of nothing, the smell of an empty box. The streets here still fall silent. When the church bell rings, doors close, curtains shift, and as I walk through, I feel that same old caution pressing in from every side, as if the village has not forgotten the truth at all. It has only learned to survive it. Reverend Elias Whitcombe's name still carries a certain weight in the village, spoken with a mix of reverence and unease. He arrived in the parish a young man, his black coat too crisp, his Bible too new. In the years that followed, he became as much a fixture of the place as the church itself. Tall, straight-backed, with pale eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, he was a man who carried the air of someone who had already decided what you were worth before you spoke. He presided over every one of the 157 funerals, his voice steady and low, his hands folded neatly at the lectern. Those who were there say that no matter the grief around him, his expression never faltered. It was not coldness exactly, but a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. When a mother collapsed at her child's grave, he did not kneel to comfort her. When an entire family was buried after a fire, he read the words without so much as a quiver in his tone. In the fading photographs that survive, the years barely seem to touch him, his hair only faintly graying, his posture unbent. The same solemn face stares back from every image, as if time could not shift it. The villagers noticed, though they rarely said it aloud. The rumors began in the quiet spaces, between pews and in the back rooms of the inn. They said Whitcombe had never once cried, not even when his own wife was buried on a frost-heavy morning. Her coffin, too, was lowered under his watch, sealed with the same care he gave every other. There was no trembling in his hands, no wetness in his eyes. When asked, he only said that grief was private, and his place was to guide, not to weep. The church records tell another detail, one that makes his composure feel less like strength and more like something else entirely. Every entry, from the first of the 157 to the last, bears his signature beside the note of sealed. Not a single coffin was closed without him present, without his final inspection. The gravediggers say he would stand over the box, murmuring something too soft to hear, before he gave the nod. Only then would the lid be nailed shut. No one ever questioned this ritual, at least not openly. But looking back, I wonder how many knew, in some quiet part of themselves, that his control over the dead was more than duty, that perhaps his dry eyes and steady hands were not signs of faith, but signs of ownership. And if they were, what exactly did he believe he owned? The official cause of death was always neatly written, the ink, dark and confident, drowning, fire, fever. But when I searched for the coroner's reports, more often than not, there was nothing. No detailed accounts, no examinations, just silence where there should have been proof. In some cases, the only explanation given was 2 words, cause unknown. It was as if the bodies had vanished before anyone could truly confirm they were gone. Stories from the edges of the parish began to surface, carried on in the low tones of people who did not want to be overheard. A fisherman remembered one night in particular, the moon high and the river black as coal. His net caught on something heavy, and when he pulled it up, all he found was a sodden coat, its pockets turned out, its buttons missing. It was the coat of a man buried just days later, yet no one ever said his body had been recovered from the water. Farmhands told me of strange nights when the barns were restless, the animals pacing and stamping without reason. By morning, a calf or a sheep would be gone. More than once, this happened on the very nights someone in the village was said to have died. It was as though something, or someone, was taking more than just human lives. When I laid the records side by side, another shape began to form. For each of the 157 funerals, there were disappearances in neighboring towns, disappearances that were never connected in the official accounts. A girl who vanished on her way home from the mill. A peddler whose cart was found abandoned by the roadside. A stranger who had taken a room at the inn and was gone by morning, leaving all his belongings behind. None of them appeared in the burial records. None of them had graves. The timeline felt deliberate, almost measured. Each loss in the village matched a loss elsewhere, as if someone was keeping to a schedule only they understood. And the more I studied it, the less it resembled a record of death at all. It began to look like a ledger, carefully maintained, with each funeral serving as a mark against another, unseen event. The graveyard was no longer a place of rest in my mind. It was a cover, a tidy arrangement to hide the truth. Somewhere, beyond the stones and the church walls, the real story of those vanished lives was being kept. And it was a story someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one would ever tell. The story begins in the winter of 1879, when the air was sharp enough to cut, and the snow along the lanes turned grey with soot. Martha Klein was only 16 when they said she died. Found in her bed, still and pale, her hands folded neatly atop the blanket. The official account said fever had taken her, though no doctor's notes survived to prove it. Before the day was done, the Reverend had spoken to her parents, the carpenter had been called, and by the following afternoon, her coffin was lowered into the ground. She was buried quickly, almost hurriedly, as if time itself was pressing them on. The frost was deep in the soil, and the gravedigger had to work by lamplight to finish before dark. He would later write of that night in his diary, though those pages would not be found for nearly a century. It was decades later, during repairs to the churchyard wall, that Martha's coffin came back into the light. Workers shifting the stones unearthed part of the plot where she lay. The lid was still nailed shut, but inside there was nothing, no bone, no cloth, only the stale scent of dry wood. The discovery caused a stir, though it lasted only days. The church called it a tragedy upon a tragedy. They said the body must have been stolen, perhaps for reasons too grim to discuss. The villagers shook their heads, whispered of grave robbers, and soon went back to their lives. But the diary tells another version. The gravedigger, a man named Callum Price, wrote that he had been given strange instructions. The coffin, he was told, must be made lighter than usual, easier to carry. He was to line it with fewer boards, and when he asked why, the Reverend himself answered, "It will be enough." Price's words suggest he knew even then that the box he lowered into the earth held no weight worth mourning. He wrote of the way the parents avoided looking at the coffin, how their eyes stayed fixed on the ground. He wrote of the Reverend standing over it before the lid was sealed, murmuring something that Price could not catch. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no shroud-wrapped form, just emptiness, hidden beneath polished wood. If Martha Skline was not in her grave, then where had she gone? And if her coffin was the first to be empty, was it also the first in a pattern that would stretch far beyond her quiet resting place? The winter night swallowed the answer, leaving only the cold earth to keep its secret. The church was never more alive than it was after midnight. On certain nights, long after the village had gone dark, a thin line of light would glow behind the heavy curtains drawn across its windows. The doors were barred from the inside, the iron bolt sliding home with a sound that carried across the still square. Those who passed by said they could hear it, the low hum of voices, rising and falling in a rhythm that was neither hymn nor prayer. The few who ever stood close enough to listen spoke of a scent that drifted from the stone walls, faint but sharp like burning herbs mixed with something metallic. It clung to the air for hours afterward, so that even at dawn the smell would still be there, carried on the wind through the narrow streets. No one asked what the services were for. Those who were not invited learned quickly to stay away. One man, who had been a boy at the time, told me of the night he followed his father to the church. They stood at the edge of the green, watching shadows move behind the curtains. Shapes passed across the light, their heads bowed, their hands raised in strange, halting motions. Then the sound came, not singing exactly, but a chant, the words blurred and foreign, repeating again and again until they seemed to fill the night. Years later, I was shown something that gave those memories a shape. A local historian brought out a set of old sketches, drawn in ink on paper gone brittle with age. They were blueprints of the church, marking every wall, every stairwell, every hidden corner. Most matched what still stood above ground, but beneath the nave, the drawings showed something else. A network of chambers, some branching away from the crypt in twisting passages. None of these were mentioned in any official record of renovations. The historian traced one of the lines with his finger, his voice low, as he explained that certain sections seemed to connect directly to the foundations beneath the altar. These were not storage rooms. They were deliberate spaces, planned and measured, hidden from sight. It struck me then, the way the chanting had seemed to rise from the floor itself, not the walls. The way the scent of smoke had crept out through the stone, as if carried up from somewhere below. Whatever happened in those locked, midnight hours was not contained to the pews and the pulpit. Something deeper was moving beneath the floorboards. Something the village had never truly seen. The steps to the crypt were narrow and uneven, carved from stone that seemed to sweat in the damp air. Each footfall sent echoes curling up the passage, as though the place were breathing in the presence of strangers for the first time in decades. The door at the bottom was thick oak, bound in rusted iron, its hinges groaning as it gave way. The air that spilled out was stale and heavy, laced with the faint, acrid tang of something long extinguished. The first light from the lanterns swept across a room shrouded in dust. Broken candlesticks lay scattered across the flagstones, their wax hardened into pale drips that clung to the cracks. Against one wall, a shallow pit held the blackened remains of burned offerings, bones too small to be human mixed with fragments of cloth and melted metal trinkets. The symbols began to appear then, faint at first, scratched into the walls in looping arcs and sharp angles. They seemed to circle the room, layer upon layer of chalk and ash, some fresh enough to smudge beneath the touch. But it was the far corner that drew the breath from the air. Stacked like discarded props were coffins, their lids askew, their insides bare. Some were warped from damp, others untouched by time, as though waiting. There was no sign of burial earth on them, no trace of having been lowered into a grave. They had been here for years, unseen, their emptiness hidden behind the altar all along. In the center of the chamber, resting on a table of rough-hewn wood, lay a single ledger. Its cover was cracked leather, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Inside, in neat, unwavering script, were the names, every one of the 157, carved into the gravestones above. The entries were meticulous, each line accompanied by a date, but some did not have dates at all. Instead, besides certain names, there were strange symbols, sigils matching those carved into the walls, each one distinct yet bound by the same strange geometry. The marks felt deliberate, purposeful, as though they belonged to a language that carried meaning deeper than words. And as the lantern light trembled over them, it was impossible to ignore what they suggested. These deaths, or whatever they were, had not all been accidents or sudden misfortunes. Some had been planned, written into this book before they ever happened, waiting only for the moment when the sigil's meaning would come due. The silence in the crypt was thick, pressing in on the explorer's breathing. Above, the church sat quiet in the night, the altar resting directly over this chamber, hiding its history in plain sight. Their names were written in the same careful hand as the rest, carved into small gravestones that looked almost fragile among the taller markers. 4 children, all under 10. Each one with a story of a sudden accident, a fall from a loft, a fever that came overnight, a drowning in the shallow bend of the river. The deaths were spaced years apart, far enough that no one spoke of them together. But when the school records were opened, the pattern became harder to ignore. Each child had been present in class, healthy and alert, right up until the week before their funeral. Then nothing, no withdrawal from the rolls, no word to the teacher, just an empty desk, their names quietly passed on to the church. It was as if they had stepped out of their lives and into some place no one dared to see. Years later, in journals kept by traveling merchants and wandering laborers, there are strange notes in the margins. A boy working in a stable hundreds of miles from here, with the same crooked smile as Thomas Lyle, buried at 7. A girl serving bread in a roadside inn, her hair the same pale gold as Clara Drew, gone at 9. In each account, the writer describes an odd detail, how the children avoided questions about where they came from, how they seemed wary of strangers, how they answered to names that weren't their own. If these accounts were true, then the graves marked for them were as empty as the others. But if they were alive, why hide them? Why give them new names, new places, as though erasing their past entirely? The question lingers like a shadow. Were they being kept safe, or kept for something else entirely? There are no records of adoptions, no guardians stepping forward to claim them. Their parents, in the rare cases they spoke of it, told the same strange tale, that the church had handled everything, that the burial was swift, that they had not been allowed to see their child's face one last time. 4 graves, 4 names, 4 lives that may have ended twice, once in the village, and again wherever they were taken. The thought is more chilling than any stone or coffin. Because if children could be lifted from their own lives, made to vanish so completely, then it means the taking was not bound by age or innocence. It means the reach of whatever was happening here spared no one. And perhaps it means that some of the 157 were never meant to be mourned at all. Margaret Dawes lived at the edge of the village, in a house where the paint had long since faded, and the garden grew wild around the fence. She was well into her 80s when she agreed to speak, her voice soft but steady, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the present. For decades, she had carried the same memory, sealed away like a secret she had promised never to tell. But time, she said, makes promises harder to keep. Her husband, Robert, had been declared dead on a rainy evening in March. The official word was heart failure. Margaret was told there would be no viewing, that the body had been prepared quickly to avoid distress. She accepted it, because that is what one did. The church handled everything, and you did not question the church. But on the night of the funeral, as the pallbearers lifted the coffin from the bier, she swore she felt the shift of weight inside, not the still heaviness of the dead, but the uneven movement of something alive, straining against its confines. Her breath caught, and in that moment the choir began to sing, their voices loud enough to swallow any other sound. Margaret's gaze drifted as she spoke, her hands twisting in her lap. She remembered the way the hymns seemed to grow louder as the coffin was carried toward the grave. Beneath the music, there was another sound, muffled, desperate, almost human. But the notes pressed over it, smothering it until she could no longer tell if she had imagined it. After the service, she was approached by two men from the church she did not know well. They stood close, speaking low, telling her there had been a change of plans. Robert was being taken elsewhere. They handed her a small purse of coins, heavy in her hand, and told her to remember only the burial. Her voice trembled when she admitted she had kept the money. "I told myself it was for survival," she said, "but I knew even then it was for silence." When asked why she was speaking now, she said the memory of the cart haunted her most. She had seen it that night, parked at the back gate of the churchyard, the lantern swaying above it. Two figures loaded the coffin inside before driving off into the dark, away from the road to the cemetery. She never saw Robert again. Margaret's story was the first to break the unspoken rule, the first to suggest that some of the 157 had gone into the ground breathing. And if her memory was true, it meant that the graves were not just empty, they were lies sealed beneath stone and hymn, while the living were carried into a fate no one had dared to name. The discovery came by accident. An archivist, sorting through the church's burial ledgers for a local history project, noticed that one of the books felt heavier on one side. The leather spine was slightly thicker there, the stitching uneven, as though someone had mended it in a hurry. When he pressed along the binding, the seam gave way with a soft crack, revealing a slit just wide enough to hold a hidden sheaf of papers. They were thin sheets of vellum, their edges curled and brittle, the ink upon them so dark it seemed almost wet. At first glance, the marks appeared to be nothing more than tangled lines, loops and angles drawn in careful sequence. But as the archivist spread the sheets across his desk, the shapes began to resolve into diagrams, each one paired with lines of tightly written script in a language that was neither wholly familiar nor entirely foreign. When the text was finally translated, the meaning became harder to ignore. This was not a list of psalms or sermons. It was a record of transactions. Names, some of them matching those carved into the gravestones, stood in one column, alongside figures written in precise currency marks. In the next column, dates, and in the last, brief, unsettling phrases, delivered, prepared, completed. The amounts varied, but there was no pattern to suggest charity or tithing. Instead, it read like the books of a merchant keeping track of goods, the value of each one measured and recorded. Only here, the goods were people. Some entries were crossed through with a single slash of ink, as though cancelled. Others were underlined twice, and beside these were faint symbols that matched those found etched into the crypt walls. In certain cases there was no date at all, only a phrase awaiting collection. The archivist admitted later that he could not shake the feeling that he was reading a contract, not between two men, but between two powers. The church's role, as it appeared on the page, was not only to record the dead, but to deliver them, alive or otherwise, into another's hands. The false binding had kept these pages hidden for over a century. How many hands had turned that ledger over the years, reading the tidy columns of official burials, never knowing that just beneath the surface lay an entirely different record? a record that did not speak of faith or salvation, but of a trade. The vellum smelled faintly of smoke, as if it had once been close to fire but spared at the last moment, and perhaps that was fitting, because the truth it carried felt like something that had been pulled back from the edge of destruction, only to wait for the day someone dared to read it aloud. They remembered the instructions most of all. The choir director would gather them in the vestry before certain funerals, his voice low, his eyes moving from face to face. They were to sing a particular hymn that day, and they were to follow the notes exactly as written, without question or embellishment. No changes in tempo, no lingering on the final note. Every sound had to be precise. At the time, none of them thought much of it. The melodies were solemn but not unfamiliar. The words drawn from scripture, though some verses felt slightly strange in the mouth. Lines repeated in odd places, phrases doubled without clear reason. One former singer remembered how the refrain seemed to circle back on itself, as if refusing to end, until it left her feeling light-headed. Years later, when a recording of one of these funerals surfaced in the archives, it was sent to a musicologist for analysis. What they found deepened the unease. The harmonies, while beautiful, were built on intervals that did not follow traditional church music. Instead, they mirrored mathematical sequences once used in certain occult ceremonies where sound itself was believed to alter the mind. The repetitions, the strange phrasing, it was all deliberate. One hymn in particular, sung at more than a dozen of the 157 funerals, contained a hidden structure when mapped note by note. The rise and fall of the melody matched a pattern found in ancient chants, the kind meant to be felt as much as heard. It was possible, they suggested, that the songs carried coded messages, audible only to those who knew how to listen. The choir members who spoke of it now did so with a nervous kind of guilt, as though their voices had been used for something they never understood. They described how, on those days, the congregation seemed subdued, their eyes glassy, their movements slow, how the reverend would watch the choir intently, as if measuring each note against some unseen standard. Even in death, it seemed, the service had been a performance, not only for the living gathered in the pews, but perhaps for something beyond the walls of the church. Each word, each breath, each lingering chord was part of a design no one had explained to them. And now, listening to those hollow hymns again after all these years, it was hard not to hear the spaces between the notes, to wonder what was really being sung into the air, and who, or what, might have been listening. The bell tower rose above the village like a watchful eye, its great iron mouth the voice of both joy and grief. For as long as anyone could remember, its toll had marked the passing of life, the slow, heavy strokes carrying out across the fields to reach even the most distant farms. But in the church's own burial records, a strange omission emerged. Out of the 157 funerals, exactly 37 had no notation for the bell, no mention of how many times it rang, no name beside the ringer, only blank space. In a village where tradition was as firm as stone, that absence spoke loudly. Older residents whispered that the silence was not an oversight. It was deliberate, a sign meant only for those who understood it, that the death was different, that it carried a meaning beyond the common rituals. They called these special burials, though no one could say what made them so. One man, a former bell ringer now stooped with age, agreed to talk. His memories came slowly, as though he were unsealing them from somewhere deep. He said that during those particular funerals, he was told not to attend the service at all. No explanation, only that his duties would not be required that day. On rare occasions, he returned to find the rope swaying gently, as if the bell had been rung once or twice by someone else. Most often, though, the air remained still above the square, the great bronze tongue unmoving. When pressed, he admitted the truth that had troubled him for years. On those days, Reverend Whitcombe himself would climb the tower, alone, if the bell was to sound at all. And when he did ring it, the strokes were uneven, soft at first, then quick, as if they were not meant to be heard far beyond the churchyard. The bell ringer believed it was a signal, not to the village, but to a smaller circle, a mark in the air to let certain people know the moment had come. Perhaps it was a warning. Perhaps it was an invitation. He could not say which. Even now, the tower stands, the bell darkened with age, its surface pitted from years of weather. On quiet evenings, when the wind is right, the villagers say you can still hear a single toll drifting down, not part of any service, not marked on any calendar, just one deep note, fading into nothing. And for those who remember the old days, that sound is not a comfort. It is a reminder that silence too can speak. They came after the last of the lamps in the village had gone out, when the only light was the pale wash of the moon. The doors of the church would open in silence, and figures would emerge, their faces hidden in the flicker of candlelight. At the center of the procession, men carried a coffin between them, its polished sides catching the faint glow as it passed. There were no hymns, no prayers, no tolling of the bell, only the slow shuffle of footsteps on the cobblestones. More than one witness remembered these processions, though few admitted to seeing them at the time. The coffins did not turn toward the churchyard. Instead, they took the narrow road that led toward the edge of the woods. Once under the trees, the candlelight thinned, swallowed by the dark. The line of figures moved as one, steady and deliberate, like a river flowing through shadow. One man, who had been a boy then, told of following at a distance. He and a friend kept to the hedgerows, careful to let the procession stay far ahead. They could hear the occasional creak of the coffin's handles, the faint murmur of voices too low to make out. When the path split, the candles turned toward the old stone quarry, long abandoned by that time. The boys crept close enough to see the light pooling in the hollow before they lost their nerve and ran. Others spoke of following as well, only to find the quarry empty when they arrived. No people, no coffins, only the disturbed earth patches of soil turned over, shallow pits dug and filled again. No markers, no remains. It was as if whatever was brought there had been swallowed whole. Years later, when the quarry was examined by those searching for answers, the same signs appeared. Fresh growth struggled in certain places, the soil loose and darker than the surrounding ground. The pits were small, too shallow for a proper grave. What they once held could only be guessed at. No bones were found, no fragments of wood or cloth that could have belonged to a coffin. What struck the investigators most was the repetition. The disturbances were not random but clustered in distinct areas, each one the same size and shape, as if following an exact plan. Whatever the purpose of those midnight processions, it was carried out here, under the cover of darkness, again and again. The quarry is silent now, its stone walls streaked with moss, the wind echoing faintly through its hollow. But on certain nights, villagers say they see a glimmer there, just a brief, flickering light, before it disappears into the trees, leaving the hollow black once more. The quarry was deeper than it first appeared, its jagged walls falling away in uneven steps to a basin choked with weeds and shadow. Time had dulled the sharp edges, but the place still felt raw, as if it had never truly healed from the years it was cut open. At its lowest point, the ground was softer than the rest, a patch of earth that seemed almost restless underfoot. It was here the first fragments were found. Splinters of coffin wood lay buried shallowly in the soil, their once polished surfaces dulled and warped by damp. Some pieces still bore traces of iron nails, bent and rusted. Nearby, a pair of broken crosses lay half-hidden under leaves, their edges chipped as though they had been struck against stone, and scattered among them were shreds of black fabric, stiff with age, funeral garments torn into strips, their seams ripped open. But it was the ring of stones that drew the most uneasy attention. 12 of them, set in a near-perfect circle, their tops stained with something dark that no rain had managed to wash away. The discoloration sank deep into the porous surface, and when a sample was taken, the results offered no comfort. It was organic, too old to test for certainty, but wrong enough to stir the stomach. In the center of the ring, the soil was churned and uneven, marked by faint depressions that could have been from kneeling or from something heavier. Those who examined it noted that the ground here had been turned over repeatedly, layers of history disturbed and mixed together. The more they dug, the clearer it became that this was not a place where remains were meant to be found. It was a place where remains were meant to disappear. Soil samples told the rest. Microscopic traces of human DNA were present, mixed into the earth itself, yet no bones surfaced, not even the smallest fragment. Whatever had happened here had been careful, deliberate. The absence was as telling as any discovery. It was the kind of void that could only exist if someone had worked to create it. Standing in the pit, the stone walls rising high on every side, it was easy to imagine the flicker of firelight against the rock, the ring of stones casting shadows across the basin. Easy to imagine the sound of voices carrying through the hollow air, the echo of something not quite prayer and not quite song. The quarry's mouth is silent now, but the earth at its bottom still holds the shape of what was done there, if not in bone then in memory. And memories, unlike bodies, are far harder to bury. It was a grey Sunday morning when Reverend Whitcombe stepped into the pulpit for what would be the last time. The church was full, though the air inside felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. He opened his Bible, but never read from it. Instead, he spoke slowly, his voice carrying the kind of weight that comes when a man believes every word he says. He told his congregation that the flock had been faithful, and that soon they would be delivered to the shepherd, who walks beyond the veil. He spoke of a pasture not of this world, where the air was unburdened by grief, and the flesh did not wither. There was no mention of heaven by name, no scripture to anchor the promises, only imagery that felt both tender and strange. Then his words turned darker. He said that the shadow of death was only a door, and that those who were chosen could be granted life after its passing, not in the eyes of God, but in the hands of those who knew the path. There is a life, he said, that begins when death has been claimed, and I have given it to you. Some sat rapt, drawn in by his voice, while others shifted uneasily in the pews. A few glanced toward the doors, as though suddenly aware of how far away they were from the outside air. The parishioner who transcribed the sermon wrote that his final words were almost a whisper, yet somehow they reached every ear. When the shepherd calls, I will walk with him, and you will know it is finished. That afternoon, the Reverend was gone. He left behind his collar, folded neatly on the altar, and beside it a heavy iron key, the one to the crypt. A sealed letter lay next to it, addressed to no one, the wax unbroken. No one saw him leave. Some swore he walked down the road toward the hills. Others claimed the last sight of him was in the bell tower, his figure framed in the high window before vanishing from view. The search that followed turned up nothing. No tracks in the mud, no sign of travel. It was as if he had stepped into the very shadow he had spoken of and not returned. In the weeks that followed, the church stood silent, its doors locked, the key to its darkest place sitting untouched on the altar, waiting for the one who would dare to turn it. The letter lay untouched for decades, locked away in a wooden drawer inside the vestry. Dust settled thick on its surface, the wax seal still intact, its deep red faded to the color of dried blood. When the church was finally marked for renovation, a workman found it while clearing the furniture. It was heavier than expected, the paper inside stiff with age. Out of curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty, the seal was broken, the crack of wax echoing in the empty room. The handwriting within was unmistakable. It was Whitcombe's, every loop and stroke as deliberate as if he had written it yesterday. He addressed no name, only a title, to the Brotherhood. The words that followed were as unsettling as they were precise. He spoke of the cycle as though it were a measured thing, a turning wheel now come to its end. The final cycle is complete, he wrote. The debt is paid in full. The 157 were mentioned not as parishioners or souls, but as fulfilled offerings. He spoke of them without grief, without hesitation, as if each life had been part of an agreed exchange. There was no explanation of what the debt had been, only the certainty that it had been settled. Then came the request, safe passage to the sanctuary. No location was given, no description, only the capitalized word standing apart in the text, like a destination known to both writer and reader. The tone suggested a place beyond reach of ordinary men, somewhere he believed he had earned the right to go. The final lines were the most cryptic. Whitcombe wrote a phrase in a language unfamiliar to anyone present, the letters curling in patterns that seemed almost ornamental. It was sent to a scholar who identified it as belonging to a pre-Christian dialect once spoken in scattered settlements of the region, an old tongue tied to rites of offering and covenant. The scholar's translation was only partial, but enough to chill the air. The gate opens to those who keep the circle unbroken. The letter was folded back into its envelope, but its words could not be sealed away again. They suggested a purpose far older than the church itself, something Whitcombe had served until the moment he vanished. The workmen left the room quietly that day, as if carrying the weight of a message never meant for their eyes. And somewhere in the silence, the idea took root that Whitcombe had not disappeared at all, that he had simply gone where the Brotherhood was waiting. The symbols carved into the crypt walls and inked in Whitcombe's hidden letter were unlike anything in the church's own history. They were older, rougher, carrying the weight of something not meant for the eyes of a congregation. When scholars compared them to regional archives, a name surfaced from the margins of forgotten histories, the Brotherhood of the Veil. Little was recorded of them, and most of what survived was whispered through fragments of folklore. They were said to have moved unseen between villages, bound by vows to keep certain rituals alive. Their purpose, if the stories could be believed, was to maintain a covenant with forces older than the cross, a covenant that demanded living offerings in exchange for the community's survival and prosperity. The taken were not killed, at least not in the usual sense. They were removed from their lives entirely, carried away to serve in ways no witness could describe. Legends claimed the Brotherhood never shed blood within the village itself. Instead, the chosen were marked, prepared, and taken under the cover of darkness, vanishing into places no map recorded. The absence of a body was not an oversight. It was the very proof of the offering's completion. Prosperity followed their work like a shadow, good harvests in bad seasons, full nets in poor fishing years, illnesses that never reached the village, even as they spread in neighboring towns. In the faded ink of old legal disputes, there were hints of their presence. Cases dropped without reason, disappearances never pursued, and always the same strange sigil appeared in the margins, the same pattern repeated with quiet precision. When placed beside the marks from the crypt and the ledger, they were identical. This connection brought a colder question to the surface, one the village had never dared speak aloud. If the Brotherhood's creed demanded the living, not the dead, then what of the 157? Were they buried in empty coffins because their lives had been claimed for another purpose? And if the covenant still held, could they still be somewhere, serving in silence? The idea was almost harder to bear than the thought of their deaths. For if they lived, it was in a place bound by the Brotherhood's mark, a place that might still be waiting for the next name to be written in their hidden ledgers. The church's records, once thought complete, began to show their fractures under closer study. Years that should have been accounted for were simply gone, pages removed so cleanly from the ledgers that only the faintest stubs of binding thread remained. There were no notes explaining the loss, no damage to suggest fire or decay. Someone had cut them out, deliberately, leaving silence where there should have been history. It was in those missing years that the village's fortune seemed to bloom. Old accounts from traveling merchants spoke of finding the market square unusually busy, the stalls heavy with grain and fish, even in seasons when the surrounding towns struggled. Illness, once an annual shadow, seemed to pass the village by entirely. No outbreaks, no lingering fevers, Even petty theft and drunken disputes, so common in other places, had all but vanished. When I spoke to the oldest residents, their eyes shifted before they answered. Some remembered it as a golden time, though they admitted it had been strange. It was like the village had been blessed, one woman said, her hands twisting in her lap. But blessings always come from somewhere. That somewhere, in whispers, was the Brotherhood. The story said that every few months, a gift was given, a person chosen, their life lifted quietly from the village and placed into the Brotherhood's keeping. These gifts, it was believed, were the price paid to keep the fields fertile, the river full, the sickness away. The choosing was never spoken of in public, but there were signs, if you knew them. A family that kept its curtains drawn for days. A house that was cleaned from top to bottom in the middle of winter. The sudden absence of laughter from a doorway where a child had always played. And then, the next Sunday, a funeral, swift, quiet, and sealed. The ledgers that survived outside the church, tax lists, merchant tallies, show subtle shifts that match the rhythm of these supposed offerings. A household vanishes from the rolls, yet no property changes hands. A name is struck from the debt records, without payment. If the missing pages of the church's history were restored, they might show the full pattern, the true extent of the arrangement. But in their absence, the oral histories filled the space, carrying the uneasy belief that the disappearances were never random. They were chosen, and in choosing, the village had traded something far greater than coin or crop. They had traded their own. They found him in a fishing village, half a world away, his name different, his accent worn smooth by decades of distance. He was an old man now, his back bent, his hands marked by years of work at sea. At first, he refused to speak of the past, saying only that it was a long way behind him. But when shown a photograph of the gravestone that bore his name, he went quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the image as though looking into something bottomless. He admitted then that he had once been the boy carved into that stone. Taken at 17, he remembered the night as a blur of cold air and strange faces. There had been no struggle, only the sudden press of a cloth over his mouth and the heavy scent of something sweet and chemical. When he woke, it was not in his bed, but underground. The walls were stone, the air close and damp. Voices echoed somewhere beyond his sight, chanting in a rhythm that seemed to pull at his thoughts. He could not say how long he was kept there. His memories came in fragments, torches burning low, the scrape of boots on stone, the feeling of being watched even when alone. There were others too, their faces lit by the same flickering light. Some younger, some older, all of them silent. He remembered being told to stand in a circle, the floor cold beneath his bare feet, while a man spoke words he didn't understand. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, he woke again, this time in the back room of a shop in a city he had never seen before. His clothes were gone, replaced with rough work garments. His pockets were empty. The shopkeeper told him his new name and warned him never to speak of where he had come from. He was told that his old life was gone, that he had been reborn into the service of the shepherd. He worked there for years before moving on, carrying the name they had given him like a second skin. He never returned to the village, never tried to find the others. When asked why, his eyes clouded. Some of them stayed, he said. Some didn't, said get the chance to leave. His story raised as many questions as it answered. If he was one of the 157, then the coffins had been as empty as the whispers claimed. And if the shepherd's service was real, it was a calling no one had chosen, a life built on a death the world believed had already come. It was an archivist's note that first hinted at its existence, a brief line in the margin of a letter mentioning the sister parish in the north. The name meant nothing at first, but when the location was traced, it led to a weathered church standing at the edge of another small village, far from the one Whitcombe had ruled. Its steeple leaned slightly, the stone dark with age, but its bones were unmistakably familiar. The layout was almost identical. The nave, the bell tower, even the narrow stairway that vanished beneath the altar. The resemblance might have been coincidence, until the symbols began to appear, carved discreetly into the wooden beams, etched into the ironwork of the gates. They matched the marks found in the first church's crypt. Some had been painted over, others worn down by years of touch, but their shapes were clear enough to recognize. The records kept here were incomplete, but what survived told a pattern already too well known. Names entered into the burial register without accompanying bodies, causes of death, vague or missing altogether. And again, that same steady rhythm, one disappearance followed by another in a neighboring town, the events never linked in official accounts. What emerged was not a single act of secrecy, but a chain. The two parishes seemed to operate in concert, moving people between them in a way that kept each community blind to the whole. A missing villager here would be marked as buried there. Someone taken from the north would be listed in Whitcombe's ledger. The coffins, if they existed at all, traveled quietly in the night, just as they had in the candle-lit processions of the first village. Those who studied the records began to suspect this network was not limited to two churches. The Brotherhood's reach might have spread further still, using a scattered chain of sanctuaries to collect and pass along their chosen offerings. In this way, no one place bore too much loss, no single village asked too many questions. The second church now stands mostly empty. Its congregation dwindled to a handful. But the stones still hold the echo of footsteps, the air still carries the faint smell of herbs burned long ago, and deep beneath its altar, the locked door waits. Whatever lies beyond it has not been opened in years, or perhaps it has been opened many times, only to be closed again before anyone outside could see what passed through. The air beneath the second church was cooler than expected, heavy with the scent of stone and dust. A narrow stair led to a chamber that did not appear on any official plans, its entrance hidden behind a wall of rotting wood. When the boards were pried away, the beam of the lanterns caught on shapes in the darkness. Altars, low and crude, set against the walls like silent sentinels. The floor was marked by a circle carved deep into the stone, its lines interrupted halfway through, as though the work had been abandoned mid-strike. Within its arc lay scattered objects, fragments of chalk, burnt wicks, and small stones engraved with symbols that matched the Brotherhood's mark. The arrangement was deliberate, but incomplete, the precision of the design broken by its sudden halt. One wall bore a smear of soot, rising from a cluster of extinguished candles that had melted into a single hardened mass. On another, faint chalk diagrams faded into the damp, suggesting a sequence of movements or steps, ritual instructions, half erased by time. Local records held a brief mention of a disturbance here decades ago, nothing more than a line about police activity during a period of civil disorder. But the timing matched oral accounts of a night when strangers arrived in the village, staying only until morning. No arrests were recorded, no explanation given for their presence. It was enough, though, to imagine the scene, the ritual underway, the circle only partially formed, the sudden sound of boots on the stair. If the Brotherhood had been interrupted, it had not been dismantled. There was no sign of struggle, no damage that suggested violence, only the quiet abandonment of something in progress, and the care with which the chamber had been sealed afterward suggested that whoever had left still meant to return. The unfinished nature of the site spoke of a plan not yet fulfilled. Whether the interruption had been by chance or by design, the work itself remained intact, preserved like a draft awaiting its final lines. For those who believe the Brotherhood still exists, this chamber stands as proof, not of their destruction, but of their patience. Above, the church looms as it always has, its stones weathering under the same wind that sweeps through the village square. Few who walk its aisles know what lies beneath, how close the ground is to the place where the circle waits. And if the Brotherhood's creed still holds true, then the only thing standing between the unfinished and the complete is the moment they choose to finish what they began. The church stands alone now, its steeple rising against a sky the color of slate. The windows are clouded with dust, the doors swollen shut from years of rain. Ivy winds its way up the stone, curling into cracks as if trying to pry the building apart. In daylight, it is only a ruin. But when the sun goes down, the villagers say it changes. They will not walk past it after dark. Some swear they have heard it then, not the groan of settling beams or the sigh of wind through old wood, but the slow, steady rhythm of breath. It comes from beneath the floor, they say, a deep inhale, a long exhale, as if the earth itself were drawing air. Those who have heard it once do not linger a second time. The sound follows them home in memory, pulsing in the quiet hours before dawn. Inside, the air is still yet faintly cold, colder than the autumn night outside. Dust hangs in the light from a cracked window, shifting as though stirred by an unseen hand. The pews are lined in their old order, though their cushions have rotted, their wood splintered. Every footstep echoes too sharply, as if there is more space beneath the boards than there should be. At the far end of the nave, past the pulpit, the altar stands exactly as it did the day Reverend Whitcombe vanished. Behind it, where the floor once opened into the stair for the crypt, the way down is gone, sealed under a thick slab of concrete. Yet when you place your hand on it, the stone is cold. Not the passive chill of shadow, but a cold that feels alive, as though something on the other side is pressing back. The camera lingers there, framing the door that is no longer a door. Silence fills the space, heavy enough to make the air seem thicker. The mind begins to reach for shapes in the dark, figures behind the wall, a shift of movement just beyond sight. The questions remain, unanswered and unanswerable. Were the 157 truly dead when their coffins were lowered into the earth? Were they taken, as the stories suggest, into the keeping of the Brotherhood? And if they lived, what life waited for them beyond the shadow of their graves? There is no proof left here. No ledger, no voice to explain the meaning of the empty coffins, only the stones, the sealed door, and the breath, if breath is what it is, that waits in the dark below. Perhaps some graves are meant to be empty. Perhaps the emptiness is the point. But standing in the nave of that church, with your palm resting on the cold concrete above the crypt, it is hard not to think that something is still there, waiting. And that one night, when the air is just right, it might decide to breathe in.